What's up, everybody? We are live with the Awesemo Waiver Wire Show, the Week 4 edition. I am Matt Gajewski, and I am here with my partner in crime, Kyle Dvorchak. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. You can follow him at Kyle Tweets here. Today, our title sponsor is Yahoo Fantasy. And before we get started, make sure you hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you know when this video and all other videos at Awesemo go live. Let's see how many likes we can get in the chat today. Otherwise, main topic, hitting the waiver wire. Now, Kyle, it was not quite the injury bloodbath we saw from week 2, but I think we do have a number of role changes to discuss this week. There are a few injuries, maybe going back to week 2, a couple guys that perhaps are returning to gameplay. How did your week 3 go? And were there any just downright takeaways that everyone needs to know right off the bat?
Yeah, like you said, it wasn't the bloodbath we saw last week. Not nearly as many injuries. Some notable ones we'll get to. There wasn't anything that was like the weirdest thing, honestly, was like Rex Burkhead had triple touchdown. I get James White wasn't active again, but like what? I just don't. God, what a. I'm not happy about that. Not happy when Rex Burkhead scores 3 times because he's not that far off the map enough that it's impossible. It's just frustrating when Rex Burkhead does that to you. I even had him on the bench in one league, and I'm going to lose that league, so I'm not happy. Outside of that, it was not a bad week. I had a lot of Bills in DFS, and most of my season-long teams have been doing quite well because I've gotten lucky in some sense and avoided the injuries for the most part. The guys I've been high on best ball are doing particularly well. Scooped up a lot of DeAndre Hopkins when he was falling in draft, stacked him with Kyler Murray. So printing money there, not a bad week.
Must be nice, Kyle. My only season-long team of high stakes had Saquon Barkley, George Kittle, Cam Akers, Tevin Coleman. So a little tough sailing for me. So this is a very important show, near and dear to my heart. I've been active on the waiver wire to start the year, and this is another week I'm going to do so because I played Dion Lewis, who apparently doesn't have a role in New York anymore. Now, there's a bunch of guys that are still kind of either disappointing for fantasy. Maybe you picked up Dion Lewis and you need to replace him. Lucky for you, a lot of role changes occurred this past week. A couple names that we'll just talk about, some big takeaways, maybe some guys ascending in offenses. T. Higgins was one we have to watch. We saw John Ross come in as a healthy scratch. T. Higgins goes 9 targets. He ends up with 5 catches, 40 yards, a pair of scores. Some were injury related. We saw Olamide Zaccheaus step up for an injured Julio Jones, and Russell Gage goes down in that game with an injury. Were there any major role changes that I think you want to target on the waiver wire right away?
So it's not the most priority target because DeAndre Hopkins is still just this target black hole, but like Andy Isabella is so much better than Christian Kirk. Andy Isabella is, I think, like tied 6th on the team in targets and is 2nd on the team in receiving yards. Like, it is so incredibly unsurprising when you look at what he was able to do at UMass, and then you look at like the 2 or 3 targets he got last year, that this dude is either going to score touchdowns or make long plays happen. I'm not excited to start him because of how many targets we're going to see go to DeAndre Hopkins, but like, I swear to God, if Cliff tries to trot out Christian Kirk again next week, assuming Kirk is healthy, I'm going to lose it. Andy Isabella is just, he's the number 2. He should be the number 2 receiver by a wide margin. I don't want to see any more Larry Fitzgerald. Please, God, no more Christian Kirk. Give me all the Andy Isabella. I'm not awfully excited to start him because, you're not going to get a ton of targets when DeAndre Hopkins is racking up, 100-yard games left and right. But man, Andy Isabella looks awesome. Outside of that, nothing crazy. T. Higgins definitely had some mental errors, but the targets are there for him, and it's an offense that I think is at least going to be exciting. Maybe not the best offense in the NFL by any means, but if they're both going to have John Ross as a healthy scratch, and then early in the year, I believe they had Auden Tate as a healthy scratch. Neither of these guys figures to play a massive role. So some young receivers, some young second-round picks that are I am excited about young receivers right now.
For sure. I initially thought T. Higgins, maybe his role would be down the road because, of course, A.J. Green's on the franchise tag and John Ross is gone after this season, presumably. But they make John Ross the healthy scratch, and T. Higgins' time came a little sooner than I think we were initially expecting. On the Andy Isabella front, I mean, we got to start banging the drum. It's Andy Isabella time. Except Arizona didn't exactly turn over the reins to him. They played 65 offensive snaps. DeAndre Hopkins, of course, 61 of those. Larry Fitzgerald, 56. But wide receiver 3 was surprised. Keyshawn Johnson played 46 of 65 offensive snaps. Andy Isabella just 26 of 65. We saw how efficient Andy Isabella was. I mean, throughout his entire NFL career at this point. I don't know what this guy has to do to actually absorb a meaningful role in the offense for Arizona. But I'm with you. I hope it happens sooner rather than later. A couple other ascending players we saw, Lamichael Pearin handle 9 carries. I think if you're adding Lamichael Pearin right now, you're hoping that Adam Gase gets fired and then they actually implement a reasonable head coach. We saw Anthony Mcfarlane take over that backup change of pace role for Benny Snell. Maybe there's some interest there. We're still kind of in handcuff territory. Brian Hill worked his way into a timeshare with Todd Gurley. John Brown has a calf injury that allowed Gabriel Davis to get on the field a little bit more. He's a pretty surprising rookie coming out of UCF. I wasn't expecting a ton of him this year. And, first and foremost, we need to talk about Greg Ward now. Former AAF superstar Greg Ward. The Eagles are now without Dallas Goedert and Deshaun Jackson, presumably leaving Greg Ward in there to, I don't know, function as this team's wide receiver 1 or 2. Anything really sticking out there as far as big takeaways and changing roles?
Yeah, I think you have to look at Greg Ward because guys like Gabriel Davis, I don't think, as long as John Brown plays, and I don't think this injury is expected to be long-term. There hasn't been much news on it, but it seemed like it was more of just like a short-term pull or a strain or maybe even just cramps. Gabriel Davis, Olamide Zaccheaus all seem to have at best limited upside. Greg Ward could reasonably function as his team's number 1 receiver for, I don't know, the next 5, 6, 7 weeks. Maybe Alshon Jeffrey comes back and takes that, but are we sure he is any better than Greg Ward at this point? Honestly, I'd probably bet on Greg Ward. Ward got 11 targets, which not only was incredible, but it led the team. It was over a 25% target share, I think. So I would say Ward, you kind of have to look at him, and he does profile as more of a mundane slot receiver. But if the Eagles are going to be losing a lot, which, oh my God, who ties the Bengals? If the Eagles are going to be losing a lot, which appears to be the case, you have to consider Greg Ward, although they do play a murderer's row of matchups coming up. I believe in no particular order, their next 3 games are San Francisco next, then Pittsburgh, then the Ravens, I think is the exact order. That is an impossible task for Carson Wentz, who I think isn't maybe as good as he was billed to be, based on that pseudo MVP season before he gets injured. But he is not being given a lot to work with and just faces a miserable stretch of games. Then he finally gets into his own division and has some easier matchups. So maybe that's a reason not to be in on Greg Ward. But if you're looking to pick up targets off the waiver wire, you can't pick up more targets than getting Greg Ward. And I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what fantasy points are based on.
Yeah, my goodness, this Eagles team has not set up Carson Wentz for success. He's 3 starting offensive linemen on injured reserve. Now he's down Jalen Reagor, Deshaun Jackson, Dallas Goedert, still waiting on the prognosis for those players to see how long they'll be out. So he's really working with their top 3 wide receivers in snaps yesterday were Greg Ward, John Hightower, and the third one is escaping me, but it's not someone that you should be actually interested on the waiver wire. And I mean, anytime your number 1 receiver is former AAF superstar Greg Ward, I don't know how hard you're grinding amateur football, Kyle, but I'm in those AAF streets playing that DFS when it was around. Greg Ward was 7th in yards per route run from the slot. He's not anything that was even fantastic in the exhibition football. So, Greg Ward, questionable talent, but you're right about him walking into targets. I had a bet on that game. The over-under was 46.5. It goes to overtime. I'm like, all right, I locked in the over. And then they tie. Anyway, so we missed Justin Jefferson. He's another guy. I think if he's on your waiver wire, he was someone that was widely drafted across leagues, but dropped in many. He comes in and replaces Olabisi Johnson. He ends up 9 targets, 7 catches, 175 yards, and a score. We know Minnesota is a run-heavy team, and they're generally not playing with the kind of tempo and pass heaviness that we saw in Week 3. Any interest in Justin Jefferson?
Yeah, definitely, some interest, not, a passing level of interest. I would probably still say Greg Ward on a team that's going to be losing and passing a lot would be my preferred pickup, but there's undoubtedly more upside with Justin Jefferson, guy they spent first-round capital on and absolutely killed it in LSU, as opposed to Greg Ward, which, like you said, he wasn't even an AF darling. So it's clear that one of these players is immensely, immensely talented. I just think opportunity would be on the side of Greg Ward. But if you're only looking for upside, say you're set at receiver and really the additions you're making right now are for week 7, week 10, guys who could break out long-term, Justin Jefferson undoubtedly, without a doubt, has the more long-term upside. If one of these guys is going to be a week in and week out receiver too, it's definitely Justin Jefferson. Greg Ward buys you more targets for the next few weeks, but long-term, Justin Jefferson more upside. And as much as, I've talked up Greg Ward's volume, I think I'd probably go Justin Jefferson here just because I don't see there being a fun ceiling for Greg Ward, whereas Jefferson is incredibly talented. He actually does have a weekly ceiling. He made one he gets kind of this moniker as a slot-only receiver. And in his final season at LSU, he did play slot only essentially. But before that, he had moved around the field and he made a beautiful contested catch down the field on the left side of the field, deep. he can do it all, even though we didn't entirely see that in his final season at LSU. Justin Jefferson, probably one of the best upside pickups, I would say, outside of maybe you could argue T. Higgins, one of the best upside receivers to pick up this week.
Yeah, if you're talking long-term stashes, really these receivers that could grow into a major role, I think you are prioritizing Higgins and Jefferson over a guy like Greg Ward, who we really know who he is at this point. Outside of that, we had Mike Williams go down with a hamstring. I'm not sure there's going to be one receiver that steps up and fills that workload for him. Also not sure what the prognosis is long-term. Watch the waiver or watch the injury report to see what the deal is with Mike Williams moving forward. We also had Jordan Reed go down with an injury. Kittle's already hurt, so that allowed Ross Dwelley, little superstar from last year on, I think like a one-game slate. Ross Dwelley was like the chalk in DFS or something, but he's back. He caught four targets for 49 yards. Maybe you take a look at him if you're super desperate at tight end. Otherwise, Tariq Cohen is believed to have a torn ACL. I don't really think this shakes up the Bears' backfield too much. Maybe you're interested in David Montgomery, but still no one you're probably picking up on the waiver wire. And then lastly was Chris Carson, who has what is believed to be a knee sprain. Last report I saw is that he's a chance to play week 4. Any other takeaways here?
Yeah, like you said, Cohen, he wasn't getting used a ton anyways, which is incredible given it was 17 million extension, I think 9 million guaranteed, and good for him, of course, regardless of whether I think he's a good player or not, get that money, especially good timing to get that guaranteed money down. But he wasn't hardly getting much run anyways. There's a few targets a game and a few carries. Maybe that splits a little bit to Dave Montgomery. We could also see some more Cordell Patterson. And in terms of Chris Carson, initially the injury was quite scary for me, like a miserable dirty hit from a Cowboys D tackle. But all signs point to at most it being a 1 to 2 week injury. And like you said, he could play. Carlos Hyde would be the pickup right there. DJ Dallas also has some pass catching chops. I think it gets split. And man, without Chris Carson, you thought you were seeing Russell Wilson cook now. Imagine what they do if they just don't run the ball at all. Carlos Hyde probably does get some run. And I think Chris Carson isn't that special. So Carlos Hyde can certainly fill in 80-90% of the production that Chris Carson was giving you. So Hyde, a good 1 or 2 week pickup, but again, not super long term. No real running back news that I think you have to be jamming in. You should have just blown your fab on Mike Davis. That should have been the move. And if you missed out on that, I don't know, tough luck. If Daryl Henderson is still out there, Daryl Henderson was clearly the lead back. He was dominant at Memphis. He was an exciting prospect coming in. Absolutely blew it his rookie year when they needed him most because Todd Gurley was essentially dust by last year. They couldn't even give Henderson 50 touches. They just didn't feel confident getting him the ball. Now it feels like they're ready to ease him into that role. Cam Akers, once he comes back, certainly could. He will play a factor in this offense. But if Henderson keeps playing like this, we saw it last year. We saw that the team does not feel the need to just jam in a rookie specifically because they spent day 2 picks on him. That same argument can be applied to Cam Akers if Henderson keeps playing well. He's probably rostered in most leagues at this point because we knew he was going to have a role coming into the season. And then it appeared that, with Cam Akers out, he was going to get that role last week. But if he is available, he's probably the number 1 waiver wire pickup. Maybe like a Myles Gaskin. I don't know how I feel about tying myself to Miami backs.
I completely understand that sentiment, especially when Ryan Fitzpatrick is out there acting like a fullback. But I think the last overarching, big news takeaway, and then we'll start diving into some position by position talk, is it's not really news from this week. It's just Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, a number of players that missed this week's game were this close to playing. They were game time decisions. Michael Thomas got a second opinion on his ankle. It looks like he'll be ready tentatively for week 4. Devontae Adams was on the cusp of playing himself. A few other guys, like perhaps George Kittle, returns. That should allow a little more flexibility with your lineups. You shouldn't have to attack the waiver wire with such immediate needs this week if you're rostering some of these guys. So I think taking the long-term approach and trying to prioritize a Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins could be the route to take. Any last overarching takeaways before we get into some position by position?
No, I like that. This is a week to kind of get ahead of your opponents by making some sneakier, not necessarily pressing week 4 needs, and just try and bank some long-term upside as opposed to there's not really a ton of news worth blowing the entire fab on. So make some long-term moves and find playoff edges against your league mates on the waiver wire this week.
For sure. Let's talk some QBs then. There are some QBs in some tough matchups, per usual. And then, of course, there's a few guys injured, like Jimmy Garoppolo. There's a few guys disappointing. However, we also have some matchups that I think are pretty tantalizing and some quarterbacks that are widely available on the waiver wire. We kind of siphon these guys out based on their percent owned. So everyone we talk about today will be at least 50% owned or less in standard leagues. So my first question, if you are streaming a quarterback, say, you unfortunately had Jimmy Garoppolo for some reason, or you just have somebody like Carson Wentz who's really disappointed to start the year, who's the number one target on the waiver wire for quarterbacks?
So right now, looking at the guys under 50%, it's Baker Mayfield says, and baby faces Dallas, a defense that just continues to get run over. And they played good opponents who, probably should be running over a lot of the defenses they face. But Dallas just getting beat up, and they play in a game environment typically where when you face Dallas, you have to score a lot of points. It wasn't necessarily as quite of an explosion from Dallas last week as it was in the weeks prior. But I always want to have my offense facing another good offense. When they're a bad defense, it helps. I know the Browns are typically going to trend towards a run-first approach, or at least a more run-heavy approach than most teams. But Mayfield does have the weapons since that week 1 meltdown. He's looked better, not perfect, but better. And man, I just love Baker Mayfield. I think he's an incredibly flashy, fun player, which is good for fantasy, certainly makes mistakes. But in fantasy, mistakes don't really punish you in terms of actual points. So I'm fine with going with maybe a riskier approach in Mayfield as opposed to, I would say Teddy Bridgewater out there is probably a safer play. I just am not entirely sure I feel the upside that I do with Mayfield.
I agree. I love Mayfield. And as far as game environment, you mentioned it going against Dallas. That opened up with a total north of 55 points. It's already sitting at 55.5 points. Dallas is going to put up some points on Cleveland, and it's going to be up to Baker Mayfield to keep pace there. So available in 43% of leagues. I think if you're streaming a quarterback, he's a very nice option. You have a couple other nice matchups. Kirk Cousins, he is 26% owned in seasonal fantasy leagues. He's taking on the Houston Texans. That game currently sits with a total of 51.5. So another pretty solid game environment. We know what the Vikings want to do. It's similar to Cleveland. They like to pound the ball. But when they're down, and their defense is just so bad and so banged up right now that they often don't have any other chance unless they just throw the ball. So Kirk Cousins, I think, is an outside consideration. You also have Justin Herbert, 2 games, 2 300-yard passing days. The guy's a little reckless. I don't care. It's super exciting for fantasy. He brings life to Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler. And then if you want to get super risky, I think Fitzpatrick is worth a look in another really nice game environment. 54-point total, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Fitzpatrick, just 7% owned in seasonal leagues. Any of them catch your eye?
Yeah, of the lower owned guys, because Baker Mayfield comes in, about 2/5 of the league, so you're not going to be able to get him everywhere. Of the lower owned guys, man, I like Justin Herbert. I think out of all these guys, he has the most long-term upside. I'm not sure I see Fitzpatrick holding that job for the entire season. Kirk Cousins looked awful through 2 weeks and finally bounced back last week, but I think we could see more of that run-first approach and not great Kirk Cousins. Like Justin Herbert, despite, maybe being in that sort of Josh Allen, Daniel Jones vein of aggressive and good for fantasy, but definitely making some mistakes, that's totally fine. We've seen that formula work out time in and time out. Herbert, like you said, back-to-back 300. He already has more. This is incredible. He already has more 300-yard games through 2 starts than Tyrod Taylor does in his entire career. I know Anthony Lynn said that Tyrod Taylor would be the starter when he returns. It ain't happening. He is not coming back to a starting role. Herbert is locked in as this team starter. He's got all the weapons in the world he could possibly want, and he's quite aggressive, available in, essentially 80% of leagues. A guy who I actually think is one of the better long-term pickups of all of the streaming options we have.
This LA team is not what we thought, and it's, they do run a lot. We knew that, but they are running way faster than anyone could ever expect. They ran 74 plays again last week. Now through 3 weeks, they are 3rd in the NFL in plays per game. Justin Herbert threw 49 passes last game. When he's in competitive games, this dude is going to be running a ton of plays. He completed 35 of them, not to mention. That's a solid completion percentage. And he has the added bonus of giving you something on the ground. It's not Kyler Murray. It's not Lamar Jackson, but it's maybe in the Josh Allen vein. That athleticism does add up. If you get 20 yards, that's, a half a passing touchdown. And it is significant in the long term. He's a guy that can punch it in on the goal line. We saw him do it for Oregon. He put up 3 rushing touchdowns against my Badgers, so I'm very familiar. I love the long-term call of, maybe playing the long game with Herbert and getting a starter, perhaps for the rest of the season, rather than just prioritizing for week 1. Anyone else outside of, Herbert, Mayfield, Cousins, Fitzpatrick, any interest?
Yeah, I mean, they're fine pickups. I think I would definitely just rank them below. I would rank even Cousins' own slightly in a higher amount of leagues, probably just because we knew he was going to start week 1, as opposed to Herbert, where if you drafted him, you had to essentially hold on to him. But I would imagine that, waiver wires prove this out, that at some point Herbert is just a better fantasy option than Cousins, and his ownership numbers rise higher than Cousins. He deserves to be there. So I'd say Herbert is probably I'd say maybe the number one pickup, Baker Mayfield 2. Then after that, they're more just spot starters. I don't want to be rostering Ryan Fitzpatrick for a full season. It has, his upside is awesome. But we've seen this time in and time out, every season, like clockwork. You can set your watch to a week 4 blowout from Ryan Fitzpatrick and then benched in week 6 or something absurd like that. And obviously they have a quarterback who is their long-term answer and Tua behind him. It's a good matchup against Seattle, so maybe there's another time you're okay going back to it. But how many more starts do you think you get? 5, 6, 4, 7, 8? I think I'm almost positive you're getting 13 more starts from Herbert, 13 more starts from Mayfield, and in certain games they'll have just as much upside as Fitzpatrick. So those guys are really 1 to 2 week rentals. Him and Teddy Bridgewater, who will be the starter, but just isn't as exciting of a passer.
Agreed, 100%. I love the call on Mayfield. If he's there, he's a great long-term option as well as this week. And Herbert offers a lot of untapped potential that we just haven't seen yet. Before we move on to the running back position, guys, Yahoo is the title sponsor today. They are the most trusted name in fantasy sports. Yahoo DFS now includes CSV uploads and CSV edit features for those looking to play multiple lineups. Make better choices. Choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. Tonight's a big game. Make sure you are checking out Yahoo for their contest on the single game slate tonight. Big matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and Baltimore Ravens. Pushing on to the running back position, man, a position with a lot of woes to start the year. Saquon Barkley goes down. If you had Saquon Barkley, there's probably a decent chance you were aggressively targeting Devontae Freeman or Deion Lewis on the waiver wire. That didn't necessarily work out. I think if you targeted Jerick McKinnon or Jeff Wilson, I know they got there with touchdowns, particularly Jeff Wilson, who's shockingly active in the pass game, is really where you got it done. Maybe not the usage you're expecting out of those guys. So if you are still desperate for running backs, who is your number one priority this week among running backs less than 50% owned on the waiver wire?
Yeah, Myles Gaskin would be the guy. Appears to be essentially operating as the lead back in Miami. I'm not sure how long that's going to last. They have other running backs that I think they would be fine using in Jordan Howard and Matt Breida, who they traded for in the offseason. But as long as the coaches are going to speak with their actions and give Myles Gaskin the workload, both as a rusher and a pass catcher, he deserves to be owned in every single league. Right now, he's coming under 50%, so we're allowed to talk about him. We won't get to talk about him next week because he will be up there with guys like, Deion Lewis from last week and Mike Davis as well. He's this week's version of those guys. I'm not quite as confident because I don't love attaching myself to, the Miami offense, although they've looked fine in both of their past 2 weeks. Week 1 wasn't as good. So Gaskin probably is a guy you can feel comfortable flexing, or I guess starting as your RB2 if you've been bitten by the injury bug. And I know some rosters have. So as far as just getting points on the board, Gaskin is clearly the guy. I don't think there are any other backs you can really bank in a lot of work. I would say Rex Burkhead, but James White isn't out because of an injury. He's out because of personal issues, unfortunately. So he will come back at full health at some point and probably relegate Burkhead. Outside of that, I don't think you're getting many fantasy points next week off of the waiver wire running back. So if you need them, you kind of have to shoot the fab on Gaskin.
It's true, and he's not even available in a lot of leagues. We're talking about a guy who's 47% owned. Gaskin really surprised me this week. He'd really just been the pass-catching back, and they'd been splitting the running game 3 ways prior to week 3, where he handles 22 carries for a very, very efficient 66 yards. Still gets the 5 targets. So Myles Gaskin, he's in play, probably a flex RB2 consideration on a weekly basis, depending on the outlook of your team. But you mentioned it. Running back is going to be tough. If you're prioritizing someone on the waiver wire, good luck to you this week. You could still look to Jeff Wilson, who is 22%. He gets there with touchdowns, but we know the San Francisco is going to run so much that perhaps he's a weekly flex consideration. It looked like Jerick McKinnon was working ahead of him to start that game. Outside of that, again, you're playing the long game here with running back. So maybe you're taking a shot on some of these guys with the hope that long-term they pan out. Someone that stands out to me is La'Mical Pearin, 6% owned across leagues. He gets 9 carries. Now, Frank Gore is nothing special at this point in his career. But is there any chance that La'Mical Pearin ends up being the number one back here? Do you think he can beat out Frank Gore?
I mean, he could beat out Frank Gore. I think he projects more as like a pass catching specialist with some running upside. I think in his final season of college, he caught like over 40 attempts and logged like 1 drop on 50 some targets. He's like talented pass catcher coming out of Florida, but I don't know. Why are you trying to play Jets players? I just can't imagine finding myself in a situation where the optimal play for my season long lineup is to get any single Jets player in the lineup. can't envision a world where the Jets scoring, 7 points on a game, and I'm counting on Michael Pearin to get that one, despite the fact that they are losing by 20 points. I just can't find myself finding any reason to really get Jets on my roster. In fact, I'm actively jettisoning them off of my roster. Chris Herndon, get out of here. Jameson Crowder, fine if I want to keep holding on to him, but what does he return to? A bunch of targets from in a meaningless Jets game? It's fine. I'd honestly rather just take the shots on Carlos Hyde and Jeff Wilson than go with any Jets player.
It makes a lot of sense. Again, Kyle and I both want to stress playing the long-term game at the running back position this week. And if you're doing so, there's a few guys that might be able to step up for a larger workload. Someone that I had circled was Brian Hill, and he's not going to be the most attractive name on your waiver wire. You like him because he's actually splitting work with Todd Gurley a little bit. Gurley carried 14 times for 80 yards in week 3. Brian Hill comes in, 9 carries, 58 yards. They both have scores. You look to the receiving game, they both have a catch. Brian Hill actually had one more target than Gurley. It's a fairly even split right now. Slight edge to Gurley still, but if Gurley were to go down, this could be Brian Hill's backfield. We saw him disappoint in that role last year, but it still looks like he's getting a crack at it. What do you make of Brian Hill at this point?
Yeah, Brian Hill, clearly the number 2 back. So should anything happen to Todd Gurley, I think there's no doubt that he would step into 3 down or a close enough to a 3 down role, what we can reasonably expect from a high end handcuff. And on the other hand, he actually could just continue to push Todd Gurley, who not only is dealing with it seems to be chronically dealing with knee injuries. So it would make sense that the team would want to limit his overall touches on the year, but could just be a lesser running back than Brian Hill at this point in his career. It is very possible that Todd Gurley is just the average baseline or below baseline level player, and Brian Hill continues to eat into this role and becomes an actual time split on an offense that sure they want to pass a lot, but they also are going to score a decent amount of touchdowns on any given week. I think Brian Hill is probably just as good, if not a better starting running back than Michael Pearin. And I would say his upside is being the one running back on a team that is so much better than the Jets. So Brian Hill, despite being owned in slightly less leagues than Michael Pearin, and this week that might not change, I would rather have him by a significant margin, in fact.
Agreed. I like Brian Hill quite a bit. If you need someone even to potentially start as a prayer flex play, you could do a lot worse. We have about 50 of you in the chat. Please hit that thumbs up button for Kyle and I and the entire Awesemo team. One great way just to support us. Kyle, I have a sneaky pickup play for you at the running back position still. It is Anthony Mcfarland. Playing for Pittsburgh, we know the injury concerns with James Conner. Now, this was widely considered to be Benny Snell's backfield, at least as far as the handcuff goes. Benny Snell, 4th-round pick out of Kentucky in the 2019 draft. This team runs it back. They draft Anthony Mcfarland coming out of Maryland this year. Benny Snell, 7 carries, 11 yards. Anthony Mcfarland, 6 carries, 42 yards, showing off that explosive ability that he was known for coming out of college. It appears Anthony Mcfarland is working his way past Benny Snell, or at least on his way to doing so. Any interest there?
Yeah, I would say you have to play in a fairly deep league because Mcfarland, James Conner is, as long as he's healthy, which I know is a statement that is difficult to consistently say, but as long as he is healthy, does appear to mostly operate as the 3-down, workhorse back, and at least enough that you can't start anyone else in the backfield as long as Conner is active. But Mcfarland, you talk about his stat line, his yards and carries from last week. How does 21 carries for 298 yards sound? That was his best stat line and just a stupid, monstrous stat line he posted versus Ohio State while playing at Maryland. Also has some pass catching chops. I like his upside as a player. I'm not sure what the role is, but we talk about it playing the long-term game. He would be a really interesting player if anything happens to James Conner. I think there's a non-zero chance he pushes Conner for some, pass catching work or some 3rd down work. I don't think it ever ends up being enough that you're comfortable starting him. You'd probably still rather start a Brian Hill because he looks as, I don't know about the 1B or the 2, but a high-end 2 in terms of in his backfield. Mcfarland clearly a step down from James Conner, but he has a ton of upside as a talent. And Conner, iconically one of the most injury-riddled players in the NFL, has put together a handful of good weeks, and I'm excited because I have a lot of James Conner in best ball. But every time I see him carry, I just clutch my rosary beads and think, please don't limp. Please don't limp as he gets off the field. So Mcfarland, you have to play in a fairly deep league, but certainly worth looking at off the waiver wire.
Again, the Anthony Mcfarland pickup is playing the long-term game, and at the running back position this week, not many injuries. It's one I think where the long-term game could be a priority for you. But before we move on to wide receiver, a fairly decent position on the waiver wire this week, I want to tell you about the Express Pass editions for Awesemo.com. We've added some great new tools for our NFL Express Pass users. For only $3.95, you can purchase an NFL Weekly Express Pass, which now includes everything you need for NFL Showdown single game contest formats. You can now access Awesemo's Showdown single game player projections, ownership projections, and top plays tool when you purchase this pass, in addition to player rankings, lineup builder light, ownership rankings, and the Top Stacks Express tool. It's our best offering ever for an Express Pass, so head over to awesemo.com/join today to purchase your $3.95 NFL Express Pass. Super, super important today, given the context of that Kansas City-Baltimore game, the biggest showdown slate of the year to date. So make sure you check out their amazing tools that Alex Baker Awesemo himself builds and uses. Looking at wide receiver, we touched on a lot of guys already. Some of the names on this list below 50% are just shocking to me. Guys that are wide receiver twos, maybe even wide receiver ones in their offense, given the injury layout of the league. Give me some of these wide receivers. Who are you targeting first and foremost?
So Nikhil Harry and Allen Lazard are probably the top two options that, like you said, how are people like, who are they rostering instead of these guys? Allen Lazard, we saw last night, explosive playmaking potential. Even though Marquez Valdes-Scantling is kind of known as the downfield burner, Allen Lazard goes deep too. Aaron Rodgers has just been incredibly aggressive throwing downfield. That works for both Lazard and Valdes-Scantling. And honestly, like up until essentially it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, Lazard was kind of just looked better as the second receiver opposite Davante Adams. If there was one of them that I would expect to have a more consistent role going forward, assuming Adams returns this week or even next week, it would probably be Allen Lazard, who, like, surprisingly they picked up off the Jags like practice squad and almost immediately started getting snaps for them. Like, he was essentially, I think last season or last offseason was his first offseason with the team. The more practice reps, the more game time action he gets with Aaron Rodgers, I think it'll only be better for him. An explosive playmaker, I think both him and Valdes-Scantling are worth rostering. But Lazard is, he's free in half of leagues, so absolutely go get him. Nikhil Harry, he's all right. He busted really hard as a rookie last year. I liked him coming out of school, but that, the doing nothing in your first year is a horrible sign. He's been good up until this week, essentially, where he got 4 targets, but that was still second on the team. I mean, Rex Burkhead, 10 targets was insane. That crowded out a lot of the other options. I think Julian Edelman only saw like 6 targets as well. So given the context of the game, his 4 targets and I believe 2 catches isn't, it's not disastrous. No receiver really had a great game for New England. Definitely worth an ad. Not quite as excited about him as I would be Lazard.
For sure. And if you were digging into the right statistics, I know you were on this last week, so props to you. I was able to get Lazard in some places. Lazard was always running more routes than Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Marquez Valdes-Scantling had scored a few more touchdowns and received a few more targets. But digging into the weeds there, you saw that Allen Lazard was actually on the field more than MVS. So he was the priority at last week. And if he's still available, prioritize him this week. This Green Bay team has thrown the ball more than we expected to start the year. Adams will be back, but that doesn't mean Allen Lazard isn't usable. Nikhil Harry, better days will be ahead for Nikhil Harry. Cam Newton had a couple turnovers. It was just not his best day overall. The target share is still what we like in that offense, and he is certainly getting it. So I think Nikhil Harry is still fine to add on waivers. Both of them are right around 45% owned in season leagues. Behind them, we start getting to receivers that, maybe there's not as much to like about them, but they still do have some pretty solid long-term promise. And you said, I wonder who these guys are rostering over Allen Lazard and Nikhil Harry. The first guy that popped into my mind is Jameson Crowder, who's like semi-owned in these leagues. And if you have Jameson Crowder, drop him immediately for one of these guys.
Yeah, the 2 guys we've talked about for sure. Take those guys over Jameson Crowder.
You don't hold on. Jameson Crowder, 8 targets per game. It's like a 3.0 ADOT with a 2 touchdown expectation on the year, and he already has one of them. So just drop Jameson Crowder if you have any chance at these guys. Anyway, Christian Kirk is 42% owned. We've slandered Christian Kirk a little bit on this program already, but jokes aside, he is still the wide receiver 2 when healthy in this offense. I think he's a pretty safe look on the waiver wire, unless we see Andy Isabella start to eclipse him. Justin Jefferson, 30% owned in seasonal leagues. Strong path to wide receiver 2 play here for Minnesota. You're a little bit worried about what they like to do, very run-heavy team, but their defense doesn't exactly project to help them play that way. As bad as they are, again, replacing 4 starters in their secondary, they had 2 starters out this past week in their secondary with Mike Hughes and Cam Dantzler. If that continues, Justin Jefferson should have some weekly viability just with the team throwing the ton. Preston Williams, wide receiver 2 in Miami, he's 30%. Laviska Shenault, disappointed in the spotlight on Thursday Night Football, 29%. And perhaps my favorite, you got to get your take on this guy, Kyle. Brandon Ayuk was making some jokes on Twitter today that Brandon Ayuk is everything that the people want Curtis Samuel to be. Brandon Ayuk's snap share rose this week. He sees 8 targets and he sees 3 carries, 31 yards and a touchdown on the ground in addition to his 8 targets, which led San Francisco, had the 5 catches, 70 yards, ends up with a touchdown and over 100 all-purpose yards. They don't have anyone else. So Ayuk, I think, is someone you could use immediately.
Yeah, you said it. They don't have anyone else. Even if George Kittle comes back, they don't have any other receivers. I know Deebo Samuel is eligible to return this coming week, but I know they talked about him eyeing a return after that just to be on the safe side of his injury. So you are probably getting at least one more week of Ayuk as the clear number 1 wide receiver on this team. And if he plays well, there's no reason that you can't expect the potential for him to continue to push Deebo Samuel even after Samuel returns. And there's no guarantee that Samuel returns to a large workload in week 5 or even week 6. It could be a few weeks before he gets adjusted to coming back from this foot injury. So I would say Ayuk is probably one of the higher upside picks. Below him, we have Preston Williams on here. Honestly, I'm not that interested in Preston Williams, clearly operating as the 2, and they rotate who they get targets to a lot. Much rather have Ayuk. Laviska Shenault, DJ Chark was out. He had an okay game. Honestly, the Jags offense, it's going to be fine if they can play in competitive games, but it's just not aggressive enough to ever really make significant comebacks. So if they play teams that I don't think are going to kill them, which is some teams should kill them because they're the freaking Jaguars. If they play in close enough games, I don't mind getting Laviska Shenault in, and you get a handful of extra carries as well, which is nice. Not a much, but it's a few points here or there.
Yeah, Laviska Shenault, the problem is, and you hit this, they're just not aggressive. He's not getting targeted downfield. He is seeing those Jameson Crowder-esque targets, and they're not coming even as frequently as, a guy like Crowder would receive them. The carries are fine in the backfield, but how efficient are these? And the long-term Shenault is still a long-term play more than anything else. He's not exactly the most usable guy on a week-to-week basis. Once we get into some really low-owned plays here, Michael Pitman is someone you could maybe look at for Indianapolis, still dealing with some injuries, but he still did not absorb a massive workload, 18% owned for him. T. Higgins, 5%, more of a long-term play, but he's slowly working his way into, a full-time role in this offense. If we look to what T. Higgins did just this week, I have his snap shares basically throughout the year. Week 1, he played 22% of snaps, 0 targets. Week 2, 65%, 6 targets. Week 3, 79%, 9 targets. This is a clear ascendance in this offense for T. Higgins. I think for a guy who's 5% owned, he's arguably one of the top wide receiver pickups this week. I think I would prioritize him over the likes of Preston, over Shenault, maybe even over Ayuk, just because long-term, you mentioned Deebo Samuel coming back. There's some questions there. Talk me off the T. Higgins ledge, man. I think I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, outside of, let's make the cutoff, 31%. So anyone 30% and under. I think only really Justin Jefferson is anyone who I would consider taking over T. Higgins. The offense is going to be so much more conducive to overall volume. Brandon Ayuk's offense is built on being an efficient running offense and getting a handful of targets to guys who can produce yak, and they have a target fiend in George Kittle whenever he's healthy. On the other hand, T. Higgins, they have Tyler Boyd is a talented slot receiver, actually got 13 targets, but he's not a guy who you can rely on to gain chunk yardage. He's not going to be this outside downfield burner. He's not going to be what we thought A.J. Green would be. A.J. Green isn't going to be what we thought A.J. Green would be. That leaves T. Higgins as really the primary outside option, unless A.J. Green finds a way to turn it around, which I don't think happens at this point. T. Higgins is the primary outside receiver for Joe Burrow, who's attempting over 47 pass attempts per game so far. It's insane how much they are passing. And he hasn't looked averse to going downfield. So I think T. Higgins probably the premier pickup outside of Justin Jefferson, who I do think, kind of has a similar target projection. He has a little less competition, but he also doesn't have as large of a pie to eat from because his offense isn't going to throw 47 times a game. So I would say still take Justin Jefferson. 1 also has the draft capital advantage as well. So Justin Jefferson 1, T. Higgins 2, if you're looking at guys who aren't basically Lazard or Harry.
For sure. After that, it's probably, I don't know, maybe Ayuk 3 for me, but it gets tough after that. Ayuk's still more of your rental rather than a long-term play. I do like his upside, but Deebo coming back sort of puts a ceiling on that. As far as just true dart throws, we have a couple other guys listed. Andy Isabella, we're just not sure what his long-term viability is at this point, but he played well on his limited snap share. Greg Ward, with Alshon coming back and hopefully Deshaun Jackson's injury is not severe, Greg Ward should be relegated to a situational player. Olamide Zaccheaus, he will retake the bench, assuming Gage and Julio Jones are able to play. Any interest in some of these fringe guys? I still have Jalen Reagor on this list just because who is Philly going to turn to once he's healthy? I think he could play a large role down the stretch.
Yeah, I'm just not sure what the long-term outlook is for him in terms of the health. Like, obviously, his talent is there. One guy I actually literally was just pulling up right now, and it's because we talked about him on our Showdown show a little bit earlier, and I'm sure I'll talk about him again tonight on Live Before Lock. On Yahoo, at least, Miles Boykin owned at 4% right now. He's clearly operating as the number 2, and tonight of all nights, he's in an absolute smash spot. And I swear, I'm in this Yahoo league that lets you cut players who have already played. I had Deshaun Jackson. I'm actually going to add Miles Boykin for Deshaun Jackson right now. I honestly don't even know how much Deshaun Jackson plays for the rest of the year. The injury didn't seem to be a long-term issue, but like no long-term issue has ever held Deshaun Jackson out from missing a bunch of games. And then there's the downside that he does come back and get injured again. It seems like no matter what he does, it just health is not going to be on his side. So honestly, right now as we speak, I am cutting him for Miles Boykin because Yahoo lets you do that, I guess.
Yeah, there's some sneaky viability to cutting some players ahead of Monday night games. If you are allowed to in your leagues, just why not? If someone gets hurt, you can get a leg up on your league mates. But let's move over to the tight end position, one I think that we have more viability streaming on a weekly basis. But before we do that, again, free stuff almost every day at Awesemo.com. Today, we have top showdown in single game plays for DraftKings and FanDuel. Couldn't be a better day to get these. Ravens, Chiefs, we have free showdown and single game plays tonight for DraftKings and FanDuel. Great resource to use for your lineups. Make sure you're checking those out. As for the tight ends, this position, a lot of people do have to target this on the waiver wire just because of the volatility at the tight end position. And the top 2 guys on our list, man, they've been through some early season struggles. We have Logan Thomas for the Washington football team, 33% owned in seasonal leagues. We have Chris Herndon, 32% owned for the New York Jets. Both of them are on the field seeing decent opportunity. The problem is their offenses are so inefficient, they're not actually able to turn that into box score production. There's a couple of guys lower on this list, particularly Dalton Schultz, who's playing for just an offense firing in all cylinders in Dallas that I would rather have over Thomas and Herndon. What do you think of these 3? Am I crazy for ranking Schultz above them?
No, honestly, we've seen it through both of these guys. I love Logan Thomas. Actually, at some point, I did think Chris Herndon had some potential, but neither of their offenses, despite, especially for Logan Thomas, the target share and their air yard share looking impressive as far as tight ends go. I mean, what scenario do you have where you actually feel confident in starting players that are getting passes from Dwayne Haskins? Those are targets, but they're not targets in the way we normally think of targets. They're not Deshaun Watson targets. They're not Ben Roethlisberger targets. They're Dwayne Haskins targets. And Dwayne Haskins is bad. And that means his targets are bad. So honestly, even though Schultz is going to have much lower market share numbers, you get so much more potential on a target Dalton Schultz that, yeah, he's a guy I'd look to. Same thing can be said for Eric Ebron, who actually, I think he was tied in the league or the team lead in targets at, I think, 7 when Deontay Johnson went out with a concussion. Not a long-term issue to concussion for most players, not a long-term issue, but it could, a short-term spike for Eric Ebron's targets. And he plays it on offense that can certainly put up touchdowns. Honestly, it's so disappointing to say because I think Chris Herndon and Logan Thomas could ultimately be as or more talented than other tight ends that we're going to talk about. Their offenses are just too miserable to really get excited about. I'd take Ebron and Schultz over them, in addition to, honestly, like Robert Tonyan and Jordan Akins kind of fall in that same tier of certainly not the same talents, but good offenses are so much better than the Jets.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, man, I think Eric Ebron is arguably the best tight end pickup on the entire week. I was giving Dalton Schultz some love because he's kind of in that same range as, opportunity-wise as Thomas and Herndon. Eric Ebron, I had to look this up. It really shocked me. People think of him as a part-time player splitting time with Vance McDonald, but coming into week 3, this is before the Deontay Johnson injury, Eric Ebron was already running a route on 74% of Ben Roethlisberger dropbacks. That's a full-time player in this offense. That's like Dallas Goedert-esque route running. He only had 7 targets on the year, but again, if you want to look at some of these underlying statistics that help predict future production, 74% of routes coming into the week was very nice, and then we see him turn that into, how many targets did he have this week? Do you know off the top of your head?
I thought he had 7 targets. Yeah, and it was tied with James Washington, actually, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm looking up right now. 7 targets for Ebron.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure it's a long-term thing because Deontay Johnson will eventually return from this concussion if he doesn't return this week, which is still in the cards. But it's still impressive, and he's not completely going unused with Deontay Johnson still in the lineup, as you said, in the first 2 weeks. He's on the field for, majority of the passing down snaps. It certainly won't be quite as good, but his touchdown upside, it just dwarfs Chris Herndon and Logan Thomas. And he does have a short-term increase spike with Deontay Johnson out. So I would say Eric Ebron, I think you can make the argument for Dalton Schultz as the better pickup, but both of these two guys I'm totally fine with starting if I've had a handful of injuries or if I thought that Chris Herndon was the answer. And clearly at this point, no Jets are the answer.
Yeah, that is a safe assumption. Now, there's a few tight ends on the waiver wire that are just gross plays. I wouldn't consider them outside of deep leagues, but one in particular that's seeing some absurd usage considering what this guy's play is like recently. Jimmy Graham had 10 targets in week 3. And this isn't a complete anomaly. The guy had 7 targets in week 1. He's playing a significant role for the Bears. I don't know what the Bears are doing from a team building perspective, but as far as fantasy football goes, Jimmy Graham is getting the rock on probably more plays than he should, but it's at least worth mentioning he's only 8% owned in leagues. You could certainly look to him as a flyer. Just there's not a lot of tight ends getting that volume. As far as another couple of deep players, Jordan Akins is 6%, the primary Texans tight end. He's not getting as much volume as some guys. Robert Tonyan popped off for a pretty decent game last night. He seems to have fully beaten out Jay Sternberger, who was once a promising second-year player. Any interest in just the fringy tight ends that are more or less just complete darts?
Yeah, I mean, I have some tight end premium teams that I have had, I think all 3 of these players on one specific FFPC team where I did draft a ton of tight ends. And yeah, you could look to them. They all have touchdown upside, Jordan Akins and Tonyan more so, I would say, just because they play with awesome quarterbacks and they're getting the majority of the receiving down snaps. Robert Tonyan clearly beat out Jay Sternberger. Darren Fells largely, get some red zone work, but largely at 6'7" and 270 or something absurd. It's just a blocker. So Akins, both these guys are going to be on the field for most, or at least, a plurality of their team's receiving down snaps. Not awfully exciting, but, essentially 1 touchdown is all you need to win or at least be competent at the tight end spot in most leagues. If you somehow come this far, these guys are certainly worth at least looking at, although we haven't had a ton of tight end injuries. I guess if you had George Kittle and you picked up Jordan Reed afterwards, these guys I would probably still take over Ross Dwelly, I guess is the line I draw.
For sure. We're starting to talk about Robert Tonyan and Jimmy Graham. I think we've absolutely touched on most of the guys you should be considering at tight end. Why don't we move over to defense, another widely streamable position on a week-to-week basis, and probably at this point in the season, the one you're actually looking to stream more often than anything else. As usual, there's defenses that find themselves in solid matchups. Last week, if you were streaming, Tampa Bay was widely available on the waiver wire, and that was an absolutely phenomenal matchup for them. They got there. Indianapolis was widely available last week. Unfortunately, this week, I had them circled as a team facing Chicago. They're 92% owned now, so you're not going to get any luck with Indy. But I do think there's some intrigue to some bad defenses in good matchups. Denver's facing the New York Jets. Anytime you get a team facing the Jets, it's going to draw some intrigue. The Denver Broncos, their defense is entirely hurt, but they still have talented players like Bradley Chubb. He's going to give the Jets trouble. Sam Darnold just doesn't look like an NFL passer at this point. So there's some consideration there. Jacksonville's facing a Cincinnati team that's going to throw so many times, so the opportunities will be there. Who are you looking to for defense on the waiver wire?
Yeah, Denver is the priority pickup. The Jets are, I would say, clearly by a significantly wide margin, the worst offense and the worst team in the NFL. Put up, I believe, 7 points against Indy last week. Really, anytime you can play, I don't care what defense it is. I don't care if you believe Carolina or Jacksonville are the worst talent-wise defenses in the NFL. Denver, dealing with some injuries, obviously gets up there in terms of the lack of talent. It doesn't matter. When you can face Sam Darnold running the plays, under an Adam Gase offense, you absolutely have to do it when you look at how beat up their weapons are. All the more reason to be jamming in any defense facing the Jets. Just a truly miserable NFL offense right now. So I don't care if it's an XFL or an AAF defense. They're probably going to have an okay game against the Jets. Outside of that, Jacksonville versus Cincy is maybe an upside play because you are going to get a lot of Joe Burrow dropbacks, averages over 47 attempts per game. And although that can be scary because that passing is the more efficient way to move the ball, it does give you a decent amount of upside. So I think that's at least worth considering, although Jacksonville's defense kind of, dealing with the lack of talent of their own right now.
Yeah, that Cincy O-line is one I have circled to as one to target all year. They're an O-line that definitely is giving up pressure. Outside of that, most of the defenses that we want to target are already widely owned. Of course, Baltimore is facing the football team. Arizona, Carolina, you might be able to get them. Indianapolis is facing Chicago. They're widely owned at this point in the year. You know, a team that's available on some waiver wires, it doesn't quite meet our threshold. 55% owned would be the LA Rams. They're taking on the New York Giants, who basically lost to the second team for the San Francisco 49ers last week. So if you can get the LA Rams, I would rank them number one, followed by Denver. And then after that, you know, it's a little bit tougher on the waiver wire this week. Thoughts on the Rams?
Yeah, the Giants not nearly as bad as the Jets, but Daniel Jones at some points just kind of looks lost out there. Is a guy who's known at least last year for not being able to feel pressure in the slightest, takes a lot of sacks, led the league in fumbles last year. Just like he's kind of what everyone rags on Josh Allen for being, at least coming into the year. He kind of is the epitome of that Josh Allen style, whereas now Josh Allen actually is just good, apparently. So, yeah, he's kind of another player that you just want to generally target with your defense. And the Rams, although, you know, maybe not a perfect defense, do have some talent on their roster. So I would say that's one of the other premier matchups you can face basically any week. I don't kind of care what defense it is. I generally want to play defenses facing Daniel Jones.
Absolutely, especially given their offensive line concerns as well. The reason we don't have as many defenses on the waiver wire that we want to target this week, there's 4 or 5 games with totals above 50 points already, which brings us to our sneaky look ahead spots. This is the segment of the show where if you need to take a dart throw on one of these players, maybe in a crowded situation, we want to target some positive game environment, and we have a number of them here. A couple standout totals at this point in the week. Cleveland taking on Dallas, 55.5 point total. We saw Cedric Wilson for Dallas, who we notably don't have on our waiver shows, I think because I widely still view Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb to be the top 3 receivers, but maybe some interest there if you want to take a flyer from the Dallas game. Dalton Schultz would be much more the flyer I consider there. Seattle, Miami, 54 point total. There are options on Miami available on the waiver wire. We talked about Fitzpatrick. We talked about Preston Williams and Myles Gaskin. That's a very nice matchup against Seattle, a team that's given up a ton of production this year. Greg Olsen also widely available for Seattle if you're looking for a punt tight end this week. Great matchup against Miami. Any sneaky look-ahead spots that you're considering, any of those ancillary plays in those games you like?
Yeah, I will say in the Cleveland-Dallas one, this is kind of the perfect scenario to get some Kareem Hunt in your lineups because he's a guy who I actually have in a decent amount of leagues because although he was expensive, I thought he could have a role, which seems to be the case. And obviously he has such contingent value if anything happens to Nick Chubb. This does set up with, you know, Dallas, I assume, being the favorite here as a team that yes. Kareem Hunt in an underdog situation is probably when you want to be playing. We saw last week he didn't get much work. He luck boxes into a touchdown essentially on a receiving catch. But this is kind of the perfect shot to get Kareem Hunt in your lineups, both an awesome total and Cleveland as the underdogs. Nick Chubb, I don't think you're benching him by any means, but Kareem Hunt is a guy who kind of exists on the fringes, especially if you have a good running back core, exists on the fringes of being a starter or not. So I would say this is kind of the perfect time to start him. And as long as Christian Kirk is out, you know, get Andy Isabella in your lineups. Just do it. You'll thank me later. I know he's going to get like 3 targets, but he's going to score maybe 5 times on those 3 targets.
That's another game we have on our list. It's Arizona taking on Carolina, a 51.5 point total right now. So you can get Andy Isabella on your waiver wire. Again, I want to project in some fluidity with these situations. While Keyshawn Johnson played ahead of him last week, Andy Isabella played so well. I think there's at least a decent shot that he ends up getting more snaps this week. Houston taking on Minnesota, another game with a 51.5 point total. This is prime Justin Jefferson territory. If you pick him up, I think you can fire him into your lineup right away. Kansas City taking on New England is a game without a total right now. On most books, at least, that is because Kansas City still has to play tonight. There's some ancillary pieces you can target in that game. Nikhil Harry under 50% owned in leagues. If you want to get really frisky with it, Demarcus Robinson available for the Chiefs. Those are 2 guys I would potentially look to. And Atlanta Green Bay. This is a game that also doesn't have a total. It's probably come out since the show started, but you know, with Atlanta's defense, I was anticipating it being around 50. Now, this Atlanta team, without Julio Jones and Russell Gage, we're not sure how long. Olamide Zaccheaus could be viable in this spot, depending on who's available, depending on who's not. For Green Bay, we hit on Lazard already. He should be owned in 50% of leagues, and he's just flat out not. You're firing up Lazard this week, I think, whether Devontae Adams plays or not. What do you think about those last final plays?
Yeah, Alan Lazard, and I think even honestly Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who I'm not quite as excited about, facing this terrible Atlanta defense. We saw Nick Foles come in and What is Atlanta doing? Come on, you got to be better than that, Atlanta. Nick Foles can't come in and lead a comeback against you. Imagine if that's what Nick Foles can do. He throws 3 scores, and I think there was another one by Mitchell Trubisky. What is Aaron Rodgers? He's going to shred them. He's going to eat them alive. So even if Devontae Adams comes back, both of the Green Bay receivers that are not Devontae Adams are still viable starts, and Allen Lazard should be owned in essentially every league.
For sure. I love Lazard. That Atlanta Falcons team, I mean, I saw some really funny stuff, just like they are petitioning the NFL to shorten games to 50 minutes. Their defense just can't stop anybody right now. They are one of the most injured defenses in the entire NFL. But that'll do it for myself and Kyle today. Of course, if you haven't heard, Awesemo has a fantastic podcast network. You can check out all of this content on anywhere you get podcasts. Just if you can't catch the YouTube shows live, it is a great way to consume content on your drives, anything like that. Bunch of shows later today, PGA, DFS First Look, and of course, Kyle, you were on the Live Before Lock show, right?
I am on the Live Before Lock show talking about what is like, might as well be called the Super Bowl. It's a shame that both these teams, Ravens and Chiefs, play in the AFC because they're probably the 2 best teams in the league by a considerable tier break.
Yeah, so if you're playing Showdown tonight, which you should be, make sure you check out the free content on Awesemo.com. Showdown content tonight. Make sure you check out the Express Pass rankings and Kyle's show later. You can find me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. He is at Kyle Tweets here. Thank you guys. We'll be back again next week. Have a good one.